and then maybe Libby and Tiger can each say a little bit about how they came to this project, and then we can kind of like have our usual discussion of reactions and questions. That sound good?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Other Internet, this organization, evolved out of the kind of blogging scene that you're all familiar with around Ribbon Farm, my blog, Aaron's blog, and that of a few others, and the consultative work that we were all doing as well. And I'm kind of like merging those into a type of organization that, yeah, tries to understand the shape of emerging media and technology, and is in a position of having strong opinions about the direction of those technologies, and working with organizations to kind of implement and propagate those ideas. So we have had a number of articles go be somewhat influential in the crypto space around decentralized branding and kind of subcultural formation. And then this project, we kind of started a visiting researcher program to work with other online writers, intellectuals, technologists who we wanted to see develop more. And this project started out of that program, and maybe around March of last year. And after like a year of research, it started publishing. And I think Libby and Tiger can say more about like the importance of this theme and like where it comes from.
Yeah, hey everyone. Yeah, we were initially interested in like centering our research around lore, kind of partially just because we were seeing that word being used a lot in a lot of different contexts online, but all sort of pointing towards like the various ways that different online communities were sort of like thinking about slash not thinking about or like intuiting this idea of like like institutional memory and like embodied knowledge and stuff like that. I think initially we were also like generally more focused on or like interested in the way that like these ideas of like history and knowledge were changing for younger generations that are like quote unquote digital natives, or like growing up in a media environment like saturated with like all of these various social media platforms. I don't know, Libby, if you want to say more.
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. I mean, it's still kind of like an ongoing project, but yeah, what we've been really interested in so far is looking at our own patterns of navigating online spaces and trying to sort of tease out the way that the sort of like novel modes of communication and memory building and like community governance almost that happens, like that evolves organically out of the platform affordances of various online spaces. And the idea of like, I don't know, it all circles back to this increasing sensibility for like self mythologization, and like language building, as a way of like accumulating really rich history as it evolves in these like spaces that don't lend themselves necessarily to like archival archiving in the traditional textual sense that we've grown accustomed to with things like books or like static media. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, guys. That is very useful context and introduction. So let's get to the discussion part. Usually we get stuck in a rut going from the top of the list to the bottom, but lately we've been trying to mix things up and go in different orders. So why don't we go in reverse order today? I see Sachin, why don't you kick us off, and then Meredith, Mayor, and Jenna, and so forth. So Sachin, reactions, thoughts?
Yeah. Hey. Yeah. Yeah. Really liked reading this, and mostly just skimmed through pretty fast. But yeah, I think it reminded me of a lot of like the Zygmunt Bauman stuff, like liquid modernity and all that. I'm not sure if there's like direct inspiration from it or not, but it's sort of like the idea of I guess basically you can like because like because you have a lot of choices, and there is no right way to make choices. You can sort of like connect them in a way that is that fits your personal context. And yeah, I think the whole thing sort of reminded me of that idea. And yeah, I think yeah, the part about like journalists or like I guess people trying to sense make out of lore is also interesting, where like you're trying to bring legibility to it, but it's that sort of like makes it very linear. Yeah, and I guess it makes it linear, and it also like tries to sort of like complete it in some way, as in like it wants to end the story. And I think like Bauman talks about this in like in liquid modernity in relation to art, where he talks about basically like art wants to be in a constant sense of becoming and not be sort of like narrowed down or like be considered complete. Yeah. And yeah, I also found sort of like the temporal aspects of the world building of lore pretty interesting, as in how it could be, you know, just like exist within a video stream, or it could exist as something like the lost meme over like 10 years or something. So that was also interesting. Yeah. Meredith?
Hi, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I really love that, Sachin. I enjoy the opportunity to. I've seen lore before, but I have never really looked into it. And I'm really impressed and fascinated, and I'm just gonna give a few reflections and I guess a question. So the first is I'm really involved in Jungian psychology, especially the work of James Hillman. I don't know if he comes up in these discussions, but it made me think about the role. So so there's a lot of talk about like psychology is a new mythology, and then like mythology is the like we all need personal mythologies, and it made me think now about how if these communities are sort of new, there's a really interesting talk from another group that I'll try and post up about this. But if say if like DAOs are the new kind of like collection of fragmented selves, like what is the mythology for that? So I think it's a very provocative idea. And I mean, when I think about mythology, I think about like Plato's Republic, and he wanted to expel all the storytellers because that is like that uh, we can use sort of like rhetoric to encourage people to do things rather than reason. But I love how now with the we need the mythology, or trying to understand what the mythology is. Like that's a core part of organization building. I really enjoyed how you sort of parsed out in one of the essays the three areas of mythologizing. There's one like around like memes. I don't have it in front of me because I'm like I can't navigate Discord on my phone. And I guess my big question is like, what are you? I mean, if after everyone goes, but I'm really curious in like how, like, what have you found when you've been discussing these ideas with organizations? Like, how do you think this exercise, I guess, will go into like a feedback loop of kind of like a self-consciousness of DAOs, like people understanding what they're doing as they're doing it? I'm really curious. So I guess I'm complete, and I hand it over, I guess, is Mayor next?
Actually, let's allow our guests to respond in real time and interrupt sort of the regular handoff. Okay, so yeah, Tiger, Libby, you guys want to respond to the question? And hello?
Yeah, so the question is essentially sort of about like what happens when organizations that are interested in creating lore become sort of like aware of these processes.
Yes, like and the processes that you have as you have outlined them. Yeah,
Right.
like what happens to their lore creation.
Yeah, we've actually been thinking a lot recently about this idea of like this idea of like instrumentalizing lore and sort of like the potential pitfalls that might come from that. I think that one thing that really struck us through our like sort of digital like ethnographic research is that one sort of valence of lore is that it feels like almost like a natural or organic process. Like most of them, like the most like robust lore of online communities that we've seen like haven't been created from like the onset goal of like creating this sort of like semiotic ecosystem. Like like semiotic ecosystems just like develop as the community develops. And we've also been finding a lot of like smaller maybe examples of like quote unquote lore baiting, where this idea of like creating lore becomes like a marketing technique that, to be quite honest, like often fails, or at least like falls flat, or seems, or like people like sniff out sort of that it feels inauthentic. So yeah, I don't know. It seems to me that there's still a pretty, I don't know, like a pretty large gap between like doing lore sort of as like a natural extension of just like the way that online subcultures develop versus like doing lore sort of intentionally. And like the real question, I guess, would be like what are the goals of the people who like deliberately want to create lore, rather than sort of like quote unquote like letting it happen.
Yeah, And then there's also more the aspect that has more to do with like I guess looking backwards rather than forward as a strategy, I guess, that could be leveraged to make the most out of a community's lore simply by just like figuring out what's the right environment you can cultivate digitally to enable the right kind of archiving or like aggregating of a community's history in a way that feels right relative to the community, and like what's the I don't know, basically it seems like there's a big there are a lot of questions around like how do you even keep track of this stuff, and rather than like trying to actively like create new lore, how do you sort of like capture the lore that gets generated organically in a way that enables it to remain legible, I guess. But yeah, we haven't we haven't exactly like talked to in a very concrete way with like institutions that are trying to like concretize or harness their lore yet.
The way you're describing it, it reminds me of like this trope of kids having nicknames for their school teachers, and sometimes the school teachers discover the nicknames that the kids have for them, but not all the worst ones. So I remember my 8th grade math teacher, I think at one point thought he was the cool teacher and told us he knew all the nicknames we had for him and sort of rattled off a few, but he didn't know the worst ones, so we were laughing about it later. So I think something like that is what happens when I guess managers discover the undercurrent of lore. There's like this mix of like hey there fellow kids thing going on, that I think we'll start to see when corporations discover lore. Uh, uh, but yeah, Meyer, you want to go next?
Sure. Okay, so because this is a blockchain talk, it was very, very interesting for me to see the contrast between what the articles are talking about, describing the internet and blockchain. And really, here's a quote, I think from How to Read the Internet. Lore isn't written in stone like the calcified records of official history you'll find in static media. Let me just change that. Like the calcified records you will find in blockchain. Okay, so we have like two opposite poles trying to attract us. We have the blockchain, which is trying to keep an official record of every single thing, of forever archives. It gets complicated. That's another quote. And we have lore, which is dynamic and living and very personal. So especially when I read this quote, instead of latching onto one fixed identity, they, people, embody various roles and play with different novel modes. So the question of how do you navigate the internet also becomes how do you navigate the blockchain in a way that makes it alive rather than dead? So I don't know the answer, but it definitely uh, brought this question into very sharp relief. The other thing that I saw here, which was interesting, and I would like feedback if there's time, and I'm reading a quote. Even though the Discord consists of basically the same people as the viewers of the live stream, it didn't have the same energy as the live streams. So I don't know if this is connected to a blockchain, but it is connected to lore. The question is why. I didn't quite understand why you believe, I mean, that it happened is a fact, but why do you think on Discord it didn't have the same energy as the live stream in TikTok. Okay, that's me.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's sort of like related to this idea of like code switching between platforms. You know, and the way that like various platforms, you know, like all have their own sort of um I don't know, like posting styles and um like grammars and stuff like that, and like the way that people, you know, interact on different platforms is just different because like partially because of the way that, you know, like the user interface is architected, and also partially because of like marketing and like what the platform like purports itself to be for, you know? And then like in the case of the live stream, you know, versus the Discord, like, or especially the fact that the live stream itself was on TikTok, like TikTok and Discord, you know, like in just in general, like enable like extremely different um forms of communication, you know, that like sort of like take place on different um scales of time as well. And so that's sort of like a large reason of like why, even though, you know, it's like the same people behind the screen interacting with each other, but because like the fact that they're on these different platforms like influences the way that they're communicating with each other.
And so, what do you think is the best platform for communicating about blockchain? Just
Um, I'm not sure if I could speak to that, but like I will say that something else that we found is that the more robust communities like sort of exist across multiple platforms and are like really able to utilize or like have a clear sense of um like community norms about like which platforms to use for like which function, you know?
okay.
Yeah, and I mean, all of all of our research so far has been like the I don't know, case studies that we've been thinking about are definitely mm, very pre Web3. Like I don't know, we've been kind of writing about the behaviors that evolve out of the transient nature of the internet as it exists in this like late stage Web 2 world, I guess, where I guess bringing like looking forward to the context of, you know, if the internet becomes um, more integrated with the blockchain, I guess, like in an abstract way, an interesting question to think about would be like, okay, how does all of this change when that transience doesn't exist in the same way as we're used to, or um, like what happens when deletion isn't as much of a like dominating force behind the way that memory and communication works on the network. um, so yeah, that's something to think about going forward, I think. But yeah, I don't know if we can really speak to that much presently.
Jenna, you want to go next?
Sure. Um, yeah, so much. This is really fun. I appreciate you guys coming today. I wanted to take the title of your piece really literally. I mean, that's what happened to me. That this like the somatic experience of being on the internet, of reading the internet. And I'm not Buddhist, but another time in my life, I listened to a lot of Dharma talks, and I really like this thing that they call the feeling tones. But you probably know this. It's there are only three. You're either leaning towards something if it's attractive to you, or you're repelled by it, so you're kind of leaning away, or you're neutral. And that feels really true for me when I'm flying around on the internet. And that I have these strong memories from early childhood. Like there was one place we lived, there was this neat wood trail through the woods that I remember just really loving running back when I could run like a little kid does, running down the trail and jumping, riding up and over the bumps and stuff. And then there's another similar memory when I was a little bit older of flying down a brook, jumping from rock to rock with a bunch of us. And the peril of that was incredibly true. And none of us fell. And I never did it again, but we all survived, and it was just a hoot. And it was really, and again, an analogy to reading the internet when I'm running hard. And the third physical thing is when I make up, which is if I were back like in the Amazon jungle running through the woods, it's the same thing. You're looking to avoid the spiny plant or the snake or the jaguar or whatever, and you're looking to grab the ripe fruit or whatever as you run by. And other than that, you just keep moving. And then to bring it back to the lore piece, so that's when you're out doing the thing you do in the jungle. And then back at night in the village, the lore is created by, I think of it as RAM, right? Like we're around this fire at night, we do storytelling. So that flavor of storytelling is how you keep lore alive and create lore, digesting everybody's experiences of the day. And then set against that, the cold storage of memories that we now have, which I don't think used to exist in the same way. So you have the Internet Archive, and to Mayor's point, we've got the blockchain, some kind of super cold storage that we're just inventing right now. And so I'm curious to know if any of that resonates for you guys, and that the final piece is just, it's been really clear to me that it used to be you only kind of knew what the cool kids in your own village were doing, and, the couple of villages around or whatever. With modernity, it's just grown and grown and grown. And with the internet and the hooking up of the nervous system of the whole planet, I have this feeling like you can know what the cool kids are doing anywhere on the world. And what do we do with that? So this pendulum between reaching out and grabbing and finding new cool things to know about, or not just cool, of course, useful, helpful, kind, benevolent, whatever, and then swinging back into a small group like the Yak Collective conversations where it is intergalactic, but it's a manageable size. So that's my really fun stuff to think about. Hand it back to Venkat in the group.
Yeah, that's a really nice facial metaphor. But I think I feel like I have the same sort of experience or like that's what we were trying to kind of articulate in that in the second article, that experience of feeling like you're constantly moving semi-autonomously, like in this algorithmic data stream, and that I think is still like, I don't know, it's interesting to think about how in the future of network of the internet, I guess, how some of that like beauty might be preserved in a context where like the I don't know, theoretical like perfect computer memory is achieved in a more accessible way, I guess, where like we might have easier or like more control over the data that we've published and collected over time. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything really more like to say on it, but really interesting stuff to think about.
Right. We have 15 minutes left, so The rest of the people, please share your quick comments, but hold your questions. And if we have time, we'll get to your questions as well in the end. So I think we were on Grigory, then it's Kamits, Brian, Ben, Arb, and Anuraj. So Grigory, any thoughts?
I'll try to be short. I mentioned this history in the making idea in the article, and it's a really interesting one because if you're looking at a small group, it's not really a history until you can share it with a larger group of people. So it's not much of a history that, some people watch some cool stream and feel good about it. There should be some significance of it for the outside world, for people who did not do that, who didn't watch the stream, who did not share this exact experience. And in my view, this is the most interesting part. This comparison between, inside view and outside view. And I am ready to pass it to Kamits.
Yeah. So it feels like maybe this needs like structure, and this is kind of like what I had gathered when I was reading, and then from the conversation, it seems like this is kind of a common theme of like you have lore, which is like an emergent thing, like bottom up, and it's kind of the like unofficial narrative, and you have like history as the official narrative. Something that came up was like in America, the American Civil War is referred to by a lot of people in the South as the War of Northern Aggression, and that's like the lore of the Civil War. But then there's the official like narrative that is basically the other way around. So I think that kind of like, I think you don't do lore, you create narratives, and then it's either lore or it's history or maybe some combination of both. But like everybody has this desire to have a narrative or to have some cohesive story. And I think a lot of this like lore craft stuff that we've been doing is trying to make things explicit that if you pay attention and spend time offline and away from like the people that think about these things, that it's really common. Like you go to like you talk to startup founders always have a narrative, and even like I think somebody made a comment of like it'll be interesting when corporations get the lore bug, and I've been a part of many organizations that either have this top down very explicit history, or there's like just kind of like these common threads. So I think that's the kind of bias we introduce by observing is kind of an interesting thing. It's like what do you do when you're actually trying to create lore? And I think Libby was mentioning like what are the implications of an organization trying to use lore, or even like a lot of the political discourse of like alt-right kind of things, like that's a very like lore driven thing and can be very dangerous, right? So I think that's always kind of the some kind of Girardian thing of like how can you use this for good or for bad, and at some point it's going to be used poorly. So those are kind of my thoughts. It looks like Ben is up next.
Hey, so what I've been while this discussion is going on, I've been thinking about is that so the internet. I mean, all these dynamics go obviously way before the internet. There was always been like lore and such. It was just so much slower and so much more self-contained due to just the geography and the time it takes for groups to form. And with the rise of the internet and the ability for things to spread like this, what we've seen is sort of huge amounts of energy, I would say, being generated, but in a very uncontrolled and possibly even uncontrollable fashion. So you end up with these sort of huge bursts of energy or storms of energy that can, I mean, maybe cause some destruction, but are ultimately transient and are unable to, really affect the world in a long-term way just due to the fact that they sort of disintegrate so quickly. And it's very interesting to look at how like this the streamer with his task and the sort of little community he gets, and it's like almost a little micro example of this, where you have this formation of this energy, and then it's consistent until he completes the task, which it doesn't take that long, and then it's sort of dispersed. And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think the goal in the sort of existential sense is that there's got to be a way to try to harness this sort of energy to, I mean, doing good is the nice thing to say, but just to do something would be a nice start, as opposed to it just, blowing up and dissipating like it always does. So that's always the thing I'm chewing on. And I think, yeah, how the and because I haven't actually talked about lore. The lore is sort of, it's interesting how it reacts so differently in the sort of internet era versus it used to be. This would be like the sort of underground history of an organization, where you would have sort of what the insiders would know really happened or so on. And of course that might not actually be true, but in any organization you could, from the grapevine, sort of learn what the lore was. But the thing is, the internet has a very hard time coming up with official narratives that aren't subsets of official narratives that are off the internet, like the state narrative or maybe the New York Times narrative or something. So in many ways, all narratives are lore on the internet, which is interesting. I'm not sure what to conclude with that, or if that's even right. But anyway, I've blabbled for enough. You can take it to someone else's. Arb or anyone above me wanted to go?
Arb? All right, looks like they're on silent mode. I can go next. I think I'm the last one then. Yeah, lots of interesting thoughts here. One thing that immediately struck me from something Brian said about the sort of alt interpretation of the events of the Civil War of North as the War of Northern Aggression, that suggests to me that lore and history have like an overlap in the Venn diagram around these sort of raw events that happened, but lore is kind of like the body politics consensus opinion on the valence of what happened. So in the South, that consensus is implicitly that it was a bad thing, something like that is kind of a potentially a way to think of it. And a kind of interesting bit of irony struck me that in the Yak Collective here, we've fallen into this pattern of kind of reversing a couple of these valences of traditional organizations. One is, in traditional organizations, everybody likes to whine and moan about meetings and hates them. Whereas here, meetings are these chats in various forms are actually the spine of how we do everything. And people actually enjoy them because we read articles and discuss substantive matters instead of like meetings being time wasters. So that's a flipped valence. That's kind of a procedural example of lore. And another is the format in which we do these discussions. Like, it's actually a rarity that the authors of an idea are even present to react. Our normal format is we have this 10-minute silent reading, which is kind of like a placeholder for the author doesn't get to speak. And then in a round of reactions, it's literally flipping the valence of like, this is more of a comment than a question. Like, you go to a typical seminar or talk in an organization, and there will always be the annoying person who steps up, like they're going to ask a question, but they kind of go into a long-winded comment and maybe never even get to a question, right? And that's become like a trope or a running joke in organization, that there's always the comment more than a question type of guy. And here we've kind of flipped that and sort of made the comment the main center stage stuff. So it's like two elements flipped. In traditional organizational lore, the author gets to speak, and the norm is that listeners react with questions more than comments. Here, the norm is that the author typically doesn't get to speak, and the reaction is by default comments rather than questions. So that struck me as kind of interesting, that lore is a way of like taking sort of the visible consensus elements of history or whatever, but then coming up with an unspoken consensus about the norms around the visible stuff. And maybe this is a way to get at what Mayor was getting at, which is like the blockchain is this hard, immutable, public historical record of what happened, and then lore is this sort of ephemeral, soft, transient thing. And what's the relationship between the two? And maybe this is it. Like the blockchain is the raw events, and from the outside, if you try to interpret them, you might come to one conclusion, but the internal silent consensus goes a completely different way, perhaps. So that might be one way to think of it. But yeah, those are my comments. I have a lot more, but since I'm myself writing a series on lore, I'll kind of save my longer thoughts for that. All right, so we have a few more minutes left. So maybe we give our guests a chance to quickly react overall to the discussion and share any thoughts they want to get out there. And then if we have time, we'll take a few more questions. So yeah, Tiger, Libby, sort of any overall reactions to the discussions, what you're planning to do next with the series and so forth?
Yeah, lots of interesting things to chew on. Yeah, one thing that I forget who said that was mentioned, but the fact that like all of these sort of like things or like energies have happened obviously like pre-internet, like, and obviously like the word lore comes from folklore. Um I think like in the beginning of our research we were thinking a lot about like, so like what exactly differentiates, like this thing that we're trying to describe, and just like more like traditional notions of what folklore is. And I definitely agree with this idea that, it's just like folklore on such a much higher, like hyper connected level. Like the fact that, um, yeah, as someone mentioned, like all of these interactions and like channels of communications are no longer bounded by things like geography. It like, I don't know, like sort of fundamentally changes the nature of communication in that regard. Um, yeah, I don't know. In general, I feel like a lot of the comments are kind of that people had today were kind of circling around this idea of like lore being like, like sort of inherently slippery and um like not easily captured, or like by definition evades capture. Um Not sure what more I have to say about that, but like that's definitely like one valence of this whole thing that, like is hard to articulate, but definitely worth trying to articulate.
Libby, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, as Tiger said, lots of good stuff to chew on here. And I don't know, I want to like research some of these names of writers to read on this stuff, particularly interested in thinking more about how the as someone said, the like what happens when something like a corporation catches the lore bug, and um I don't know, what are the potential like r- dangers even of what it looks like when institutions start to recognize the power of lore craft, I guess. And what are some examples of like this happening on a large, even like national scale, and how might that be affected by technology, I guess. sorry, no, I don't know. It's nothing very concrete, but yeah, this has been great.
All right. Let's see. Aaron, you haven't spoken at all, so I don't know if you're in listen mode. But yeah, you have any thoughts as well since Toby kicked us off? Maybe you have closing thoughts?
Sure. I think what's been so interesting for me about this is seeing linguistic processes that normally play out in slow motion, so slow that you can't really perceive them, get speed run, so that the way the way languages form and the way inside jokes form and the way that semantic voids accrue meaning, it happens so fast that you can kind of see the dynamics of how it plays out. And the other big thing is, I think it's often said that a lot of theory is just autobiography in disguise, and this feels kind of like the fundamental anxiety of trying to track a non-linear narrative development on the internet. Is like, is this just what I'm seeing because of my position in the network, and is there really like one cohesive story or a migration pattern here, or am I just seeing myself kind of reflected in a sort of funhouse mirror? And I think that adds a very interesting element to any kind of like lore analysis that you're doing in this very like non-linear, non-geographic setting.
All right. Thanks, everybody. This was a great discussion, and I'm sure everybody has a lot more thoughts. And feel free to post them in the blockchain governance channel and hang out and chat more. And yeah, this has kind of given me a bunch of new threads to pull on that I think I suspect I'll be mulling on for the next couple of weeks as I continue my own thinking and writing. But yeah, thanks to the other internet crew for joining us today and sharing your thoughts, and we look forward to reading the rest of your series. So yeah, give us a heads up, and yeah, welcome back anytime to continue discussions.